Okay, so I'll try to make this quick. I'm part of a group called the Victoria Healthy Masculinity Collective, and we organize this counter event to compete directly against Jordan Peterson's event, which is happening at the same time. But more than simply critique him, we're here to talk about what draws people to him, the good, the bad, and to hopefully offer positive alternatives to those ideas. We want to acknowledge that people aren't black and white. Fans of Peterson are drawn to him for different reasons. Some of those fans are here today to hear what we have to say. You're going to hear from speakers who are from a wide variety of backgrounds and have differing beliefs. While all of them have critiques of Peterson, some of them may enjoy his self-help material, for example. So you're going to get a wide variety. One of the limitations of having this event is that we won't be able to tackle everything. Peterson says so many things that it is impossible to respond to all of it within the confines of this discussion tonight. And to illustrate that point, I put together a collection of controversial statements that Peterson has made in about the last 24 hours or so. There's actually a lot more. We couldn't fit them all. So if we don't get to something, it's not because we're cherry picking or because we don't want to talk about it. It's because we just don't have enough time. And so with that out of the way, I would like to now introduce our speakers. Each speaker will have up to 5 minutes to introduce themselves. Before we get to them, I want to give a special thank you to Dr. Rita Dalmoon. Some of you may have seen her on earlier versions of the poster, but unfortunately, Rita is not able to speak today. Despite that, Rita has gone out of her way to support this event, booking the space for us for free, getting our sound equipment, and even helping us to find speakers. If we could give Rita a round of applause for everything she has done, that would be amazing. Let's start with Dr. Simon Glezos, who's a professor here at UVic from the Political Science Department. His primary focus as a political theorist is on continental thinkers of the 19th and 20th century. Given this theoretical archive, his work engages with many strands in contemporary political theory, including new materialism, post-structuralism, feminology, radical democratic traditions, and contemporary Marxist and anarchist theories. Please welcome Dr. Simon Glezos.
Thank you, and you don't know if you like me yet. So, I am not mic'd up, so if you have trouble hearing me, please let me know, and I can try to yell louder. Probably also worth saying out loud that although I am a professor at the university here, I am here not as a representative of that university or the political science department. I speak only for myself. But I am sort of here as a representative of academia as an institution. One of the things that I found myself thinking about in relation to this is that Peterson sort of represents a particular kind of academic creature, which is a person who is very knowledgeable about their particular field, and I'm not from the psychology department, but by all accounts, a very well-respected scholar, at least in his earlier work. And there can be a tendency amongst such people, I feel a tendency myself, to presume that your expertise in one particular field then extends to a general comprehension of all such things, and a kind of willingness to opine on all such things. And that when you do that, you are just as likely as anyone else to have your own biases and prejudices shape your thinking on it. But because you have styled yourself a kind of expert, you presume that you speak with a sort of objective authority on it. And so that's sort of one of the things that I find concerning is the trappings of kind of institutional authority and expertise that go along with what is very much repeating the kind of general cultural biases that we have around issues of gender, around questions of race, around questions of homosexuality, transphobia, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of one of the reasons I thought it important to participate. And I thank you for the opportunity.
All right. We're going to take our order. So Kyla is a YouTube and Twitch content creator who focuses on politics, psychology, and socio-cultural commentary. You can find her content at notsoErudite, that's ERUDITE, all one word, anywhere on most platforms. Please welcome Kyla.
I don't think I'm on. I will project loudly until I'm on. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah. No, she's not.
I'm on. I can hear myself. Hi, I am excited to sit next to somebody who probably knows 30,000 larger words than I do. I'm interesting in that I come from a bit of an academic background that transitioned into streaming and kind of the socio-political commentary world. So when you think like Matt Walsh or Hassan Piker, that's going to be more like the space that I occupy. I'm excited to talk to you guys today because I probably have maybe a bit of a different perspective than you maybe expect at this talk, which is that I kind of was an old school fan of Peterson in like 2016. And have become increasingly disappointed with particularly his like new branding post-COVID, post like maybe possible brain injury. That's been so much more targeted on hatred. It's been so much more targeted on picking at specific individuals. Which has been incredibly disappointing to watch. And when I look back at what books that he wrote, it feels at great juxtaposition of some of the like pretty meaningful life lessons that I got from some of the books. And so I want to kind of offer this nuanced take of there's the good and the bad as kind of iconicized by his like really weird suit. You guys, the blue red one, if you guys have seen it, super edgy, super YouTube core. And I think it's a really good visual of my concern about what often occurs when people transition from kind of one space into a very fast-paced, as somebody in the YouTube world, toxic space. And the things that it does that forces people to become partisan and close-minded. And it's sad. And it needs to change because so many people are listening to TikToks and they're listening to YouTube and they're getting in their head these partisan worlds that like, sometimes we can't even talk to each other on either side. And that scares me. And I want to see that bridge. So that's probably the role I'll occupy here. So you might like some of the stuff I say and you might dislike, and I'm open to feedback from anyone. So thanks for having me.
All right, next we have Jack. He is a TikTok creator who focuses on masculinity. He offers masculinity, guidance, and support. You can find him at WatchfulCoyote, one word. Please welcome Jack.
Good evening. I'm Jack, and I'm very honored to be here. Honored to be welcomed, and honored to be in your city and your university. And I grew up in a very harmful environment, harmful iterations of masculinity, lots of addiction, lots of domestic violence. And I inherited those patterns, and then I carried them forward into my early life and perpetrated harm in my community. And the process of learning to see that and then moving forward with the awareness that I had caused harm has been a wild road that led me down a decade of suicidal addiction and depression.
Could you have the mic close to your
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Thank you. I appreciate the feedback. Yeah, it's been a long ride, and it's faced a lot of hard things in myself and reshaped my sense of self. And I speak about that pretty openly these days. And I speak about the fractals of those same patterns throughout all of masculinity and, frankly, all of Western civilization. And as Kyla was saying, there is a lot of nuance in these conversations. And I really hope that we can get into some of that nuance tonight. because often the truths that we're aiming for are larger than any one single statement can encapsulate, and attempting to do so sets us up for blind spots and failure that perpetuate harmful patterns in very insidious ways. So I'm looking forward to teasing out some of the detail about, like, even simple phrases like, you should try and be a good man. Depending on the impact or how that is being said, it can either point us towards growth and health and wellness, or it can point us towards stagnation and very problematic patterns. So I'm excited to get into the nuance tonight, and I think that many of the people here, just by virtue of self-selection, will understand some of the broader strokes of Peterson's problematic rhetoric, and I'm looking forward to getting into some of the more nuanced iterations of the ways that his rhetoric creates layers of separation between men and self-love. So I'm excited to be here. I'm honored. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for witnessing me in my growth, and I look forward to continuing to be in conversation and witnessing all of you in yours.
All right, next we have Rachel Johnston. She's a registered clinical counselor, an educator and consultant, and a parent of 2 teenage boys. She also has a master's degree in political science and international relations. She has particular interest in the central question of identity and belonging. Please welcome Rachel Johnston.
Thank you. Is my mic on? So yes, my name is Rachel. Just the lapel towards you. Put this one towards me. I got too nice. All right, we'll get there. Yeah, I'm a clinical counselor. I have a private practice here in Victoria, and I'm interested in the mental health layer of Jordan Peterson and some of the self-help piece. I also, being a mom to 2 young men stepping into adulthood, it's been interesting to see what influences are out there and the culture of masculinity that is welcoming or shaping their thoughts, and so that's also been, I also come with that hat as a parent. And there's also the reality for me that I grew up in a very female, I have a lot of sisters, it was a very female world, and my mom too, there was a lot of generations of just women, so I wasn't really exposed to boy culture in certain ways in my own growing up, and that's been interesting to have 2 boys and to see some of those differences and how society views even the boys when they're small. And I think the idea that was talked about already about that socializing that happens really early. So I'm interested in having a broader conversation about what that can look like and how that can change and what people's ideas can contribute to that. And yeah, I'm also really looking forward to having it be a conversation, so I'm excited to have audience questions and all of us to sort of feed off of that. That's me.
All right, finally, Will is the host of the philosophy podcast, Existential Will. Please welcome Wilczak.
How's this sound? Hi, I've been a local of Victoria for about 12 years, and then I guess I've traveled a lot in my childhood, only to land on what is colonially known as Galliano Island, and kind of been stuck here, but it's fantastic on this campus to get input and knowledge about colonization processes and how it affects all of us, and it really kind of puts us into a very materialistic and bad place mentally as well as physically, and I think that definitely applies to the men that Peterson does appeal to. I mean, I think that we ought to talk about how men are oriented performatively and moralistically into the beasts of burden. I think that need to push forward materialistic gain as opposed to even from my own existentialist angle, as opposed to more spiritual, spirited freedom, as opposed to this very kind of set and dogmatic position that Peterson is increasingly taking, that is ironically quite contrary to a Christian or a very humble orientation or aura, I think. And so there's certainly, from my own philosophical background, having a bachelor's in philosophy and constantly engaging with the professors in philosophy here, they are all quite in agreement that, in a historical sense, Peterson is what's known as a sophist. In its time, that term in ancient Greece was known as a wise man or sage, but it became a derogatory term because of the notion of being great public speakers, charging money for exorbitant fees for knowing things and telling young men and influencing them on that. Whereas Socrates, and then later I think Kierkegaard in his own time, were insistent about a lot of these sort of touring men, that there was this notion of do they really know things? Do they really have the knowledge that qualifies them for influencing and shaping people's morality? And so I'm here to say and argue no, but there's certainly bits and incredible things harkening back to the disaffected men, I think, that we ought to have conversations about. But certainly not at all should it be divorced from our discussions about women being disaffected, about two-spirited people, about trans people, and queer people. And so that's certainly, it all needs to be one conversation. And so I would end it there.
So I just want to give a reminder to our audience and to our speakers to come at this discussion from a place of respect and a place of open-mindedness. Not everyone is going to agree, and that's okay, but treat each other kindly. All right, so we're going to start with a pretty open-ended question here. What does healthy masculinity look like to you? And whoever wants to start.
I can start. Tradesies. So I've been reading a lot of feminist literature, and I'm going to fail to cite her properly. I know I'm going to look way smarter if I know people's names. But there's a writer who's talking about the feminine and the masculine, who specifically uses words like femininities and masculinities. And I think when we're talking about masculinities, we're talking about global conceptions of masculinity that are isolated and yet conversational between different kind of niches and groups that create a bit of an emergent pattern of masculinity. But as I'm sure you're all aware, that's deeply culturally informed. What is, an ideal masculine figure in a Hasidic Jewish, kind of subgroup is going to be very different, for example, than what's going to be hypermasculine in Edo-Japan. And so what I think is really interesting is looking through history and stories and pulling out emergent themes between these things that we see kind of universally. And I think there's a second part here, which is that masculinity and manhood are probably understandably somewhat linked. But the problem is that I don't believe masculinity is inherently tied to being a man. I see women occupy masculine roles and masculine traits. I see non-binary folks doing the same thing. And I think when I look at healthy masculinity, I look at emergent themes, but I don't lump that into only men can do this, right? So when I say something like healthy masculinity means assertiveness, my favorite thing is assertiveness training, particularly for women, because it's undoing the social programming, as I think as our beginning speaker said. And so healthy masculinity to me looks like what we've seen emerge through the history of masculinity, but it's an opening of the bridge of who can actually occupy those roles, who can be courageous, who can be assertive, who can be these different things that we maybe associate with masculinity and not pigeonhole it into a man.
I believe that we inherit culturally the idea that there is an ideal man, one way to be masculine in the world that is better than all others, and that all men are on some spectrum of being closer or further away from this paragon of masculinity that no man has ever actually been in or could be in, because it's a fiction. It's a tiny fictional box that we create as an ideal, and it has the effect of separating men from self-love. Because that ideal box that we create, that no man has ever been in or could be in, is the place where male self-love exists. That's where you can feel like you're worthy, you're enough. And because it is a fiction, then we are always removed from that. So we are separated from self-love. My therapist once asked me a question. She said, if you were about to be born, would you want to cause a bunch of harm to people around you? And I said, no, of course not. And she said, that's your unwounded self. That's yourself before your trauma. That sense of yourself that exists before and in an unwounded way, that ideal has both masculine and feminine elements in it. Whoever you are and whatever your identities are, I really loved how Tiffany put this at the very beginning. So to me, when I think about what healthy masculinity is, there is, for me, the only possible answer for that is it is you. You are healthy masculinity underneath your traumas, beyond the wounds that you've inherited, beyond the cultural lenses that harm you. The part of you that feels masculine, that is healthy masculinity, once you manage to tease out all of those cultural pieces of nonsense that are forced down our throats from before we're even born.
Oh, here we go. Okay, is this working? I appreciate both those views, and I particularly the idea of having masculine and feminine, that it's not attributed solely to men, and that women can, and that in fact it's very Jungian to have the anima and the animus in your psyche, that these are aspects of being a person in the world, and you amplify different aspects depending on what your interests are and how you're socialized. So I think there's evidence across the board in different disciplines that support that idea, and it is interesting to wonder then why there is this tiny box. Like, where did this tiny box come from? And I think part of that dovetails with a lot of Peterson's rhetoric around how the patriarchy, and how he defangs patriarchy as a simple expression of competence. I think ultimately that is not actually power over, but in fact patriarchy is harmful for everyone, for men in particular, because in my view like a healthy expression of it would be that that tiny box needs to expand, and there needs to be a broader spectrum where masculinity is understood in a variety of variants across all kinds of performative expressions of self. And so for me, in contemplating this question, I think what comes up is authenticity, that a healthy masculinity reflects an authenticity that's singular to each person, which in a way speaks to the self-love. And if you're able to connect with that, then that allows for the expression of masculinity to take on many forms.
So I'm gonna have to be a little bit of a bad guy, because we're a bit short on time. But I didn't want to say anything to masculinity before we move on to the next question.
I just want to tag on 30 seconds, which is that when we try and create traits about healthy masculinity, if you say healthy masculinity is assertive or whatever, then you automatically exclude huge numbers of people.
Yeah.
So it is more for me about what the impacts of our behavior or traits are than the traits themselves. You can be quiet in a weaponized way, or you can be quiet in a very safe way. So we can't say a healthy man is a quiet man. We have to say, what is the impact of this person's quietness through their masculine lens? Now we're tracking whether it's promoting health or not.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's start with something positive about Jordan Peterson. So his self-help books have sold millions of copies, and many people, especially men, feel his work has had a positive impact on their lives. So what is Peterson saying that is appealing to so many people? What does it get
most of my career right now in the manosphere. Don't know what that is. Things like Fresh and Fit podcast, Andrew Tate, pickup artistry, Red Pill. That's the space I tend to occupy. I spend a lot of my time talking to these men and trying to understand what's happening. And I think there's something really, really important as somebody who's just, I'm very left, so I identify in my in-group. There's something that you've left behind, I think, in the conversation, which is the answer for 14-year-old boys who have been socialized in such a way. There's often high levels of fatherness, there's intergenerational trauma amongst men with war and history that look out into the world and they go, who am I? And what is masculinity? And I would agree with Jack. I would like to get to an ideal where the answer is, whatever. It's kind of whatever you want it to be. The problem I think that we have for 14-year-old boys, for 15, for 21-year-old boys that have high levels of negative sentiment, who are angry and frustrated, some for good reason and some for not, is giving them something tangible to hold on to. And I think particularly when I talk about this, I'm going to delineate between like pre-2018 Jordan Peterson and kind of post-COVID Jordan Peterson, because I personally feel like there was a shift. Pre-2018 Jordan Peterson, I think for a lot of men, when I hear them talk about it, was a guy who was willing to sit down, tell it to them straight, life's hard, you gotta take responsibility, people might not appreciate you, and that's gotta be okay. And I think he put into language things that a lot of us understand about the world, whether we like it or not, and gave us simple answers as to how to correct that, which I think for a lot of men is more than they know what to orient with. And so I think when we talk about Jordan Peterson, I think it's really important to remember that millions of young men found something in his message, and even if we don't like it, we have to figure out what it is to provide that answer in healthy alternatives.
So one of my hobbies is there's a lot of little free libraries in my neighborhood, as there are. People know what I mean when I say a little free library. And so whenever I'm occupying little free libraries, I open them up, and there are invariably self-help books in them. That's one of the things that people put in little free libraries. And so I just grab self-help books at random. So and read them because I need a lot of help for myself. And so I read from the 60s and from the 20s, and the thesis I've come out of that project with is that for almost any self-help book, half of it is good. It is a surprising account of that for the simple reason that, and I don't mean this dismissively, most of the things that you get in a self-help book are banal. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in the way of it's kind of things that we know, and that we know that we need to know. And usually what a self-help book does, in the same way that a good sort of therapist or something like that does, is frame it in a way that resonates with us and gives us the ability to kind of follow that. And so, which is to say, to the topic, solidly half of the Jordan Peterson book has good advice. Visions of responsibility, of presenting yourself with a positive aim for life. These are helpful things that unquestionably help people. The other thing I have learned from reading those self-help books, though, is that it's the other half that is the more concerning half, because it's the other half that seats those relatively banal observations within a worldview.
And we'll get to that half.
Yes, we will, and I won't go into that. But that's simply to say that, I think there is this sort of necessary guidance. And I don't disagree with the idea that it's sort of necessary to unpack what that is. At the same time, right, I don't want to give too much credit to it on the assumption that there is something particularly novel or unique about that, when in fact, a lot of these things show up across sort of it. And so part of what's interesting then is that question of what makes it resonate. And I think that's something not identical with its value as guidance.
I keep this brief. I think he gets the celebration part amazing, and it is so rare today to see people openly celebrating masculinity. And that is such a necessary medicine, especially for those of us who have criticisms and have nuanced critiques of how masculinity shows up, or for people who have simply experienced those as young men. To see this older man openly weeping and talking about how much he loves men, that is a balm to my soul. Even though I disagree profoundly with so much of what he says, seeing an elder man weeping and talking about how much he loves men, we need that.
Thank you for saying that, Jack. I think this goes to, for me, the heart of belonging, that he provides a place of belonging.
Yeah.
And that the celebration of, and the pride of being a man is so limited by the ways in which men and masculinity is being deconstructed, that I think it's left a lot of men feeling disheartened and confused. And what Jordan Peterson gets right is he delivers something prescriptive, and he delivers something that is like a club that you can come and belong to. And so I think that's important. It's important for all of us here, actually, because it's why we're in this room and not at Savon, because it also makes us wake up to the fact that he has highlighted that there's this vulnerability there that needs to be addressed differently. And so what are the alternatives to people like Peterson, and that's where my interest is how can we cultivate just as compelling alternatives, and what does that look like? And so understanding, and for this is where I feel grateful for people who do stand up and take on the public discourse like he has, despite aspects of it being problematic, because he's advancing conversation, and he forces us to define and refine our values. And so he gets that right. I will give that to him, and I'm appreciative of what he contributes, because it makes everyone else adjust accordingly. And I also think the self-responsibility is something that is missing, and it's a big part of his message. And I think that he also gets right. Do we have time? Are we? Yes? Are we taking?
I think, I agree with the initial premises, certainly, of requiring that we would need to promote kind of responsibilization, when I think a lot of modern society would sort of pull people along in their lives and in their roles. I think that can just sap people of agency. And I think even in his own conservative manifesto that he wrote, you'll find him advocating for agency and responsibilization. But I mean, then the negative aspect, and I think like the final kind of telos or end goal for these sort of things is with him towards things like traditional family and the home and churches, and like even though we find, and family, but even though we find, actually, if we discuss with particular concrete people, you find in their concrete lives that their households are terrible. I mean, and they've had to distance themselves from their own family members. I mean, it's like there are aspects of such incredible disconnect of regarding value. I think like regarding if someone comes out, whether as someone who's queer or someone who's realizing that they're trans, it's like there's a huge severance of agreement on those accounts that I think Peterson actually exacerbates rather than meshes together. And so certainly we want to responsibilize all of us into kind of a community, and I think you would agree with that. It's just I don't see that he is responsibilizing himself, I think.
So let's stay on the topic of self-help. Is there anything that Peterson gets wrong on this subject?
keep it over.
Just self-help.
Self-help. I know, he could go in a lot of directions.
I think Peterson is super one size fits all. He gives really practical advice for people that will kind of adhere to the orthodoxy pretty well. If you're straight, if you're white, a lot of his advice works. It literally does. As you said, it's kind of the banal stuff that tends to work, right? He's not wrong. And he puts it in a language that appealed to millions of people across multiple political spectrums, which is meaningful. The problem is that when you don't adhere to orthodoxy, when you're an individual who's genderqueer or non-binary, or you're a man who tends to occupy highly feminine spaces, the advice probably doesn't fit as well. It's like a onesie that says one size fits all, and you put it on like it's way too tight on your butt, and you're like, yeah, this is not a one size fits all onesie. I think that's a really big issue that happens. And I also, when I read Peterson, he misses, I think, like the most important part of postmodernism. He just kind of vilifies it, where he kind of treats it like this feared thing that is seeking destruction and trying to kind of tear out society from underneath us. When being able to deconstruct inherited things is, I'm sure as a therapist you would say this, one of the most fundamental things to self-growth is looking back at yourself and going, who am I and why am I specifically, right? He likes that word. And he likes to say it that way too. I think when I listen to Peterson, he misses that important piece of postmodernism that I think is like one of my favorite parts about postmodernism is the deconstructive element. And with his adherence to orthodoxy, he forgets about things like joy. And when I look at young men who are anxious and suicidal and angry, with a system that has objectified men as basically sources of utility, GDP mostly, my heart hurts because so many of them have missed the question of joy, right? I feel like so many guys, I'll talk to them and they're like, gotta walk my dog today, we worked on training. I'm like, just walk your dog, bro. Like, just enjoy it. Just be like, my puppy's cute and has a little boop on his head. That's all you need to do, right? But men are like, well, it must be productive, which is socialized into them, as Tiffany said super, super well. And I think that's sad. And I think that's like, he's so opposed to happiness. And it's like, man, happiness is so important. Anyways.
Yes. Forgive me, I wasn't checking my email there while Kyla was talking. I just wanted to make sure that I got this right, but I couldn't find it, so never mind. To get very specific in terms of things that I think he gets wrong, one of the sort of 12 rules of life that he identifies in his book is make sure your children don't do anything that makes you dislike them. I read that, it was like I touched a hot stove. Like I just viscerally reacted to that. And this is one of those moments where I say, like, as a father. But it aside, and I understand, right? He says, oh, this is about understanding that they're social beings and that you have to raise them to be part of society and that therefore they need to understand their feelings. Fine, right? But I mean, you can't disassociate that from his feelings on trans people or on gay people and such. And so you can't read that and not see that as an authorization to parents, to fathers specifically, that they are allowed to enforce those kinds of beliefs. But more than that, it's a vision of not just fatherhood, but the relationships between people that for me is so alien from the experience of parenting that you would even think about it in those terms, right? Because kids do things all the time that make you dislike them. I genuinely, right? It's just that screaming is just real loud, you know? And that's not what it's about. But it implies this certain kind of not community membership, but possession and ownership, right? And that's where, going back to, we've sort of mentioned this focus on responsibility and agency, right? And I think that is valuable. And when I was talking earlier about sort of the other side of the worldview, what concerns me is that it is this particular kind of retrograde masculinity in which it is presented as being about responsibility and duty, right? But the flip side to that is the presumption that taking on those responsibilities and duties gives you a certain status in society. That being a responsible adult and father means that you get to determine that your child cannot do things you dislike, rather than what is the obvious fact, which is a child has no responsibility to make you like them. That's not what it's about at all. And if you go into that relationship thinking that, the results will be catastrophic, as they so regularly are. So that's to just that one thing. Anyways, all in there.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. There's two pieces I want to touch on really quickly. And the first one is I am now 10 years clean and sober. And I see myself so clearly in Peterson 10, 15 years ago. When I look at him, I see how wounded I was. It's like looking in a mirror, and it's fairly painful. And I remember identifying as a monster. I spent a long time thinking of myself as a monster. And that also separated me from a sense of self-love or a sense of worthiness. Because when we hear the word monster, we do not immediately conjure in our minds a being in healthy relationship with themselves or in healthy relationship with anyone around them. There is a violence and an isolation in it. So his rhetoric is playing into this violent, isolated identification of masculinity. So right out the gate, he's rebranding, or he's appearing to rebrand the same tired iterations of masculinity, and that's one of the reasons it's so compelling, is that it resonates with men because it's like, oh yeah, I am a monster, so I do feel like a monster, and this person's speaking to my monster's nature. Separates us from self-love and community. The other thing I want to bounce off of is that concept of responsibility, he said, become a monster and then learn to control it. And in that, embedded in that statement, is the possibility that you are not in control. And this is such a fundamental misconception about how we exist as humans. You are always in control of your actions, always. You are never excused from responsibility. And his rhetoric creates a ready-made excuse for men to be like, oops, my monster slipped its leash for a second, and now I reinforced a patriarchal hierarchy over you, and now you're terrified of me, but it's excused because I'm a monster at my core, and it just slipped control for a second. No, you are always responsible for who you are. And any rhetoric that separates us from responsibility in all of our actions, in all of our emotional states, is actively perpetuating domestic violence and sexual assault. And that is what Peterson is doing with his rhetoric of, you need to learn to control your monstrous nature.
Well said. I think part of what the two of you touched on, and then the monster thing is very interesting, but it speaks to what I see in Peterson as he has a very low tolerance for discomfort, and so when he wants, if his children are making him uncomfortable, he needs to exert control, and this concept of anything that's chaos, he needs it all to be ordered, and what he ends up doing to, I think, calm himself is work in moral absolutes. And so he peddles that as a kind of medicine for the general populace. And there is something comforting about someone being able to give you a recipe for, you're uncomfortable and life's hard, and here, just do this and you'll feel better. But there isn't that agency, and that he implies that you don't have agency, that you just have to exert some kind of self-discipline and then you'll be better. And I was listening to him, and it was alarming as a therapist because he was speaking with a younger clinician. He was a psychologist who was saying, and I don't know if anyone works in mental health, but one of the basic tenets you learn when you first study counseling is from the humanist perspective, that you bring unconditional positive regard to your clients, and that when it's unnerving when you walk into the room and you're like, how am I going to do this? If you just do that, then you're doing a lot, because so many of us, we don't have that we're not received in that way, where all of you is welcome, there's no judgment, and you can bring everything here, and it's a positive experience to unpack whatever's happening in your life. And he's speaking with this younger clinician, and this clinician says, I try and do that now in all areas of my life, and I bring unconditional positive regard. Peterson says, I don't do that at all. I don't believe that's useful. And in my clinical work, what I focus on, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically he's saying, what I focus on is people come to work with me to say there are things that are working in my life and there are things that are not working in my life. And my role is to help them towards what's working in their life. And so we look at that together, and then we make a plan, and that's part of why they're paying me to be in that role. And it suddenly clicked for me that this is where his right and wrong and moral absolutes gets transferred onto the world of self-help, and dangerously so in my mind in terms of a clinical setting, because it's so paternalistic. It's like you're the child that comes in, and I'll tell you what I see you need to do, and then you'll get the prescription and off you go. And it lacks the capacity, and this goes to what I think I see in him consistently, of his level of discomfort, that he's not able to sit and hold space for someone to then move into all of those places with themselves that's not comfortable at all, which is one of the skills as a real therapist, is that you're able to do that. And that's what's also cathartic as the client, is that you're going to be held in that space. And he can't manage that, and so he moves into the father knows best model. And I think it is also part of his appeal. So, because if father knows best, you don't really have to grow up. He's just going to give you something to do, and you're going to do it, and now I'm a good person. The end.
I guess I'd like to speak about maybe so it's the negatives of some of his self-help stuff. Well, I think that just taking him to task regarding him following his own rules has often enough been problematic and but that goes with being in the public spotlight, certainly, just heavy scrutiny and analysis. But I mean, certainly we have to talk about the kind of tangent that he's gone on, I think, ideologically, even though he's got a rule that says abandon ideology, but he has a very specific kind. And I think when he's become so politicized was when he went on a bit of a tangent in his first book, where it's saying, don't bother children when they're skateboarding. And I think the process of that chapter was that he was acknowledging what were called skate stoppers that were inputted onto pavement, and sort of like the equivalent against skateboarders of like anti-homeless spikes or something like that. Sort of deters skaters from joy, from happiness, from leisure. And I think that certainly ties all the way back to his insistence on utility, which is where the contradiction happens, I think, because he doesn't actively go and take out these skate stoppers. Instead, he goes on a tangent about Solzhenitsyn and about the rigorous kind of paternal role that the Soviet state ended up having over its people. But I mean, to the degree that he is himself, he poses a lot of his moral absolutes, his own. I think there's just that you'll keep finding over and over a lot of angles that you find that he's very hypocritical. And I think that he doesn't follow his own self-help rules as he insists on others following them. And I think that would be enough to see and understand his problematic character.
I'd be curious what you guys think. So I'm going to approach this kind of from a femme-bodied person. When I think about masculinity, there's this, let's see how it's moving anyway. Yeah, thank you. Healthy masculinity. Yes, thank you. There's this tension when I think about masculinity. When I'm moving through space, actually this is a great example. I'm sitting next to two masculine-bodied people, and I am smaller. And there's this reality. If you've ever like wrestled, especially as a femme-bodied person, with a dude, it's an experience where you're just like, I'm paper, right? It's very disconcerting. And so I think for men, there is this, I think I understand what you're saying about the verge of the monster, because there's this self-loathing validation that I don't want men to hear. But I can't shake the responsibility that I think is a burden on large-bodied people always, which is the tension of the actual like physical way that they must show restraint, right? When you grab a woman, even if she's about to jump in front of a train, you gotta be kind of careful how you grab her. You don't want to be and like break her wrist and be like, I don't see you from the train, but sort of her wrist, right? There's this tension that men must exist within, where their reality is always small femme-bodied people, non-binary, smaller-bodied people are often going to be at a power difference here. And good men and good large-bodied, masculine-bodied people have to hold the tension of how do I stay self-loving, which I think is great. And I love that you talk so much about healthy masculinity and its connectivity to self. But there's responsibility of strength that is kind of unfortunately thrust on men by just simple biology. Just the fact that you guys have big bodies and testosterone's annoying, right? That men must always contend with. Because I think good men want small-bodied people to feel safe. I think that's probably one of the most pressing issues, like the Me Too movement and whatnot, is women insisting that men understand that we need to feel safe. And so good men must occupy this tension of, I don't want to do harm. Of course I don't. But then the reality of my body means that there must be some level of control. And I don't want restraint. I don't want stuffing, right? I don't want any of that toxic Victorian garbage stoicism. There needs to be a healthier way that men learn this kind of reticence. And I'd be curious what you guys think about how men deal with this tension of being within their body and the self-love, but the necessary kind of self-restraint that they're going to have to carry just because of their body, assuming they're able-bodied men particularly.
Yeah, so.
So I take your point, and I to the extent that I want to push back on it, it has to do with I'm concerned with the invocation of simple biology, and what I find myself thinking about is not just the obvious point of bodily diversity, right? You brought up the point there about disability as a confounding element, but also the ways in which different bodies are conceived of as being dangerous, right? That's not a sort of universal signifier, right? As we know from sort of any number of cases, right? A 12-year-old body is seen as big and threatening if it is black in a way that it isn't if it is white, right? And the extent to which a body is allowed, excuse me, to be threatening or not, whatever that means, varies wildly depending on questions of race, ethnicity, religion, et cetera, all of that. And so I think there's something to be said there about this question of how does one think about strength and that's relationship to other people and one's responsibilities and how we think about that. But I think it's worth noting that that's something that isn't as simple as masculinity is related to strength and femininity isn't. That instead there is this much more complex question of kind of what kinds of strength people have, in what contexts, how is their strength perceived, how is that viewed as threatening or non-threatening. I think that dramatically shapes the whole space in which that happens. So again, not to sort of reject your point, but simply to complexify it.
Yeah, I think the nuance you bring up there is I think the nuance you bring up there about the black bodies is a really good point, and actually something that I want to touch more into, because when I'm talking about this tension that exists, exists. It's not a glorification. I think it is sad and not good that there's an assumption of dangerousness. And then to some extent, particularly when we compare like normative femme bodies versus masculine bodies, or large bodies versus small bodies, there's this tension that is somewhat hard to get around. And so the question isn't, is this good? I would say self-evidently no. The question for me is, since this seems to be a descriptive reality that exists to some degree between body sizes, how does one learn to navigate that? When you have a body that's perceived as dangerous, how do you experience yourself in a real way that's self-loving, while also being mindful of things that go on? And I want to talk specifically about masc to femme, because I think it's a different dialogue when we get into different intersections. So I want to talk like broadly, generally, and then maybe we can go into the nuance of intersections as well.
Jack, is your point clear?
Quick.
Okay.
I wholeheartedly agree with what you are saying, and I would frame it in the context of being a step in healing from the wounded forms of masculinity that we inherit. So as young men, for example, are learning healthy consent processes, which almost none of us learn as very young men, we almost invariably have to go through a mindset of restraint, of controlling ourselves. But once you learn to shift your fundamental motivations and see that you don't actually want sex, what you want is connection, what you want is to feel accepted and loved. And once you are operating from those things as a fundamental baseline, that is your motivation for this interaction, then you no longer need to identify as violent being controlling itself. And to me, that is the more long-term goal, is the transition from capacity, because we are going to have some capacity, all humans have some capacity to cause harm, but we learn that as an identity. We all inherit this idea that I identify as violent, as capable of harm. And you see these guys walking around, bundles of identifying as harm. And then when you experience healthy men, it's often because they no longer identify that way. They might still have the capacity, they might still train in martial arts or whatever, but it's not who they are, it's not how they think of themselves. So I would celebrate what you're saying, that emphasis on restraint and control as a step, not as a long-term goal. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but that's how I think about it.
All right. Outside of his self-help content, Jordan Peterson has faced controversy for his cultural and political beliefs. What positions of Peterson's, if any, do you find to be the most problematic, and why? I'd like to actually start on this side this time. So, Will, do you want to start us off?
Sure thing. Cultural and political. Was that right?
Yeah, so anything not related to self-help.
Right. Well, I think even just within his self-help material,
He said not.
that's where he infuses a lot of his cultural and political input, where I have kind of gone through many of the history books and quite a bit of philosophy, not too much, and found that a lot of it is inconsistent regarding preserving in his own goal a lot of liberal democracy, a lot of hopes for individualistic liberty, a lot of rule of law kind of stuff. But where it's to the degree that he's very hardline against egalitarian notions in almost all of its flavors, except for equality under law. But to the degree that, though, that he promotes a lot of inequality and against interpretations of power that might go with that. There's a tremendous problem of his notion of valuing the Age of Enlightenment and liberalism, but what came out of that was tremendously egalitarian. It wasn't a complete project, certainly, when the founding fathers themselves owned slaves and women were not enfranchised, but the impetus was all there in that philosophy, and he's completely glossed over it. And usually in his books, he's not even citing any specific people like Jefferson or Franklin, who was saying, the U.S. in his time did not have exorbitantly rich nor exorbitantly poor people. It was actually a fairly, ignoring certainly the African American population who were mostly enslaved. I mean, there's a degree immensely of materialistic leveling out, where a lot of people were treated just as citizens, and the notion of equality of birth, or that Jefferson put into the Declaration of Independence was a notion of, you know, not having an aristocratic caste, or certainly not exorbitant corporations, but certainly things of just far more cordial, you know, materialistic safeguarding and well-being that I think we ourselves have not actually fulfilled very well. And it's particularly regarding the U.S., it's this notion that he is nevertheless appealing to, but in an inverted kind of way, and it's just very complicated. And that's what I would start with saying. Okay.
Thank you. It is complicated because he's so, I mean, this is part of, you know, when you say, what does he get right? He's a great salesman. And he, part of that is that he's incredibly clever and can hold a lot of information and really out-debate most people. But the reason he does it, and this is, now that I see it through this lens, it actually is less complicated, is because he uses probably every single example of logical fallacy that exists. And he gets into psychological persuasion. He is a master of it. And what I described prior, where he was talking to that clinician, it maybe took him 3 minutes to have that clinician go from unconditional positive regard to, well, maybe, yeah, I should have more judgment. He's like, you know, it doesn't really help anyone if you don't come in with a way to, you know, assess what's good and bad. And so he said, yeah, maybe it's just positive regard. And he even got him to say, maybe it's just regard. because he was saying, well, why, if you're endlessly positive, how is that helpful to your client? You have to be able to say, what you just said or how you're describing your life makes me really uncomfortable, and I don't think that's a good way for you to be going, and this is going to be a better outcome. And so let's strategize about how to make you a good man and, you know, implement all of my theories around living a good life.
I'm just going to interject. We're starting to go back into the self-help stuff.
Oh, sorry, it's my domain. But the logical fallacy is actually consistent in all of his cultural and political writings and interviews, and that's why when you watch him, he is so stealth in how he manages his interviewers or how he has conversations, because that's what he is a master of psychological persuasion within that, and he does all of it. He does straw man, he does, you know, fallacy of cause, he does, I can't think of all of them, but he runs through all of them. In fact, I was thinking we could have a game of teaching logical fallacy. You get to like hit a button every time he does it, because he does it really well.
Yeah. So I am from the States, and those of us who are not openly supporting the rise of fascism in that country have learned the hard way to read between the lines and see where people are pointing. Because Mr. Trump was a master of pointing in towards a conclusion that everybody was listening could tell what he was saying, but not actually saying it outright in a way that he could then be held accountable for what he was saying. And I experienced Dr. Peterson identically. So 2 months ago, he outright said that he believed that women should legally be the property of men again. And he did it just so insidiously.
You know, you talked about one of the advantages of the sexual revolution was the transformation of the idea that rape was a property crime, let's say, into a crime against the woman herself. And I would say, look, I have plenty of sympathy for that perspective. And I think it's fundamentally true. But I'm going to push back because, you know, all this is all very complicated. You know, it isn't obvious to me that offers women enough defense. You know, and so the counter argument might be, if untrammeled sexual access to a young woman is a crime, in order for that to be recognized as a crime properly, it has to be viewed as something that will bring the males on her side to her defense in principle. Now, maybe not, right? Because you could say, well, maybe we could set up a society where merely, quote, transgressing the rights of a woman to say no is sufficient. But it's not obvious to me that that's sufficient. Like maybe sufficient means not only do you violate the integrity of the woman in a fundamental sense, but you enrage all of her male protectors. And then that's enough of a barrier, because God only knows how much barrier we need.
What he was saying was, I understand why there has been this push for feminism and freedom of women, but I just don't feel like it's protecting women enough. And I believe that women might actually be safer if they were considered the legal property of men again. So he's not actually arguing that, he's not making enough of a point that you can say, you just said you believed women should be property. He's just guiding your thoughts right up to that and letting the momentum carry you to the conclusion that he won't actually say outright. And I find that abjectly terrifying.
That's hasty generalization.
Probably the biggest thing that's made me, like I said, it was kind of a previous Peterson. I enjoyed a fair bit of mostly the self-help work. I was never really into the political stuff, but what made me really kind of turn, first of all, never look at the Twitter of anyone ever. Just a pro tip, including yourself. Don't even look at your own page. Like, what? Why did I say that's not even funny? Watching the way in which I remember specifically how we talked about Elliot Page, and I remember him talking about butchery. He was using this extreme language, and seeing him move from like Bible lectures and kind of the self-help stuff that like some of it's good, some of you like give or take, to constantly, endlessly talking about like fear of transness in general, fear of woke scolds, and the specific targeting of trans individuals. Like Elliot Page is just doing his life. He's just like, I'm chilling, and he's getting attacked. He's getting talked about. When he talked about the bikini model as well, it was this targeted attack against specific individuals that was so like vengeful and just nasty, that I was like, yuck. And then I listened to like Ukraine Russia stuff, and it's like kind of like, like your grandpa gets like pneumonia for like the third time, and now like everything's about like Vietnam, and like even he's like, oh, COVID was about Vietnam, and you're like, no, grandpa, like, that's not what's going on. I feel like that's a lot of the energy that's happening. It's kind of this partisan talking point, where any level of like nuance or questions that maybe some were definitely problematic, and then others were probably good questions to pose about things like men crying. It's like I don't hear that anymore. I don't watch his content anymore. So I prepped for this by watching a bit, and I think of the last 10 videos he's released, like 4 of them were on detransitioners or like the fear of transness. And I feel like that is like so far from the important conversations about things like economic divide and if you want to talk about political conversations, I'm sure you have probably more than even I know that are more pressing, and it was disappointing to say the least, and it felt like a betrayal of so many past kind of ideals that were held
up. So I'm a political theorist, which means sort of a philosopher, and so I want to talk at least a little bit about his overarching theory and sort of his role as an unreconstructed union. To those of you who sort of are not familiar with the kind of Jungian psychoanalysis, it essentially follows along from Freudian psychoanalysis. Freudian psychoanalysis is the idea that we are not fully conscious of our motivations, that we are driven by a fundamentally unconscious mind, which, whatever its faults, is very much the dominant way in which we think of thinking today, right? The idea that we are subject to these kinds of subconscious forces. Jung's insight was to talk about the collective unconscious, the idea that we don't just have this individual subconscious that shapes our conscious mind, but that we are part of a collective unconscious. And that therefore collective archetypes, narratives, ideas fundamentally shape our perception of the world and our perception of ourselves. Again, it's a very useful and insightful idea, right? The idea that we need to be attentive to the dominant frameworks and narratives through which we come to understand ourselves in the world. Where the problem comes is that for Peterson, the goal then is to universalize that structure, right? To take that structure as innate and by and large to connect it up to questions of biology, right? Which requires a complete indifference to history and culture. That as soon as you have any sort of experience with the history of these categories, we're talking about gender here, and so that's sort of one to look at, we see that these supposed archetypes change constantly throughout history. Even if we just look at it within the West, the idea that there are these dominant archetypes of order and chaos and masculinity and femininity is nonsense, right? That any actual detailed engagement with the thing that I always tell to my students is, so if you go back and read the Iliad, right, supposedly the foundation of Western civilization, if you go back and read the Iliad, which is the story of the Trojan War, right, there's the great warrior Achilles. And one of the big important events in the plot is they're dividing up the war booty, and Achilles feels insulted by not getting his fair share. And so what he does is he goes and he sulks in his tent. And there's this long sequence of him sulking and crying in his tent because he feels like people aren't being nice to him, right? To the Greeks, this was an ideal example of masculinity, right? Because big, powerful men have big, powerful emotions and they're overtaken by them, right? A while back, they made a movie about the Trojan War, Troy, and Achilles was played by Brad Pitt. There is no point where Brad Pitt goes and cries in his tent because people are being mean to him, right? Because that's so at odds with our conception of masculinity, right? It's a very simple thing to see, to go, well, of course these things cannot be universal because they change constantly. And that's just looking at it within the Western tradition. As soon as we go outside of that, and Tiffany spoke very movingly to this, about the variety of matriarchal and matrilineal cultures that exist globally, that have to be completely ignored. And this, by the way, is that the root of the way in which patriarchy as a concept is fundamentally linked to white supremacy as a concept, because it requires the colonial expulsion of other conceptions of gender. Right? And so I think that, to me, is the most dangerous element of Peterson's project, is this universalization of what is a fundamentally cultural phenomenon. And to take something that is worthy of interrogation, and that he even begins to interrogate and recognize the power of, and then just stops. Because to interrogate that would fundamentally be to challenge the authority and hierarchy that he has so invested in. Right? And I think this point about his discomfort and his fear and his paternalism are linked there in that unwillingness to take that extra step that would require the unsettling of his own status. So, yeah.
And I think and just to dovetail off of some of that quickly, I think that the other piece is what you were saying earlier, that he masks, he sort of seduces everybody with his status and his expertise in one area, and then the universalization or whatever it is he starts to speak about politically, and he makes these leaps of logic that you're with him, and then suddenly you don't understand what happened. You're barefoot in the kitchen, and you were, that wasn't where this began, and I think that speaks to the way that he relies on science and his own comportment that reflects academia and expertise and rationale, and so he pulls people along and makes it like this is the unassailable, inevitable conclusion, and when it's not at all, and he doesn't allow for any other alternatives. And so I think that that's part of his magic in terms of seducing his audiences to sort of get them from A to B.
It's so quick. I just can't let this pass by because your point is such a good one about existing within these frameworks and these lineages, but then not being willing to take that self-reflective step. And there is a fractal for this that exists within all people, especially masculine people today, where if you identify as masculine in any way, you exist within a lineage of thought about masculinity that started millennia before you were born and will continue long after you die. And most men inherit this framework of individualism that prevents us from ever being able to contextualize ourselves within this work as a historical effort. And therefore we experience this deep grief and shame about ourselves because we make it personal, as opposed to recognizing that it is an expression of the lineage that we are a part of. And when we keep that lineage at arm's length, we also abandon our agency to change it. So we must recognize that we are part of this lineage of thought, and hopefully a lineage of healing, in order to bring it close enough and say, I know patriarchy just as well as I know my own hands, and for exactly the same reason. And I can choose what to do within that, but it requires that step that Peterson doesn't take, that most men don't take, to be honest. We hold it at arm's length.
Most positions of power have traditionally been held by men throughout history, including those of political leaders, religious leaders, employers, police, and judges. But men tend to be overrepresented in homelessness, suicide, and workplace deaths, among other statistics. Do you find patriarchal organizations of society to be in any way limiting or harmful to men? Why or why not?
A wave of anxiety, depression, self-doubt, self-harm, and for men, a lot of shame. And I think the antidote to that is some of what Jack was saying about self-love and how to create. How do you bring that into? How do you deconstruct patriarchy so that's available, essentially? But one of the people that I think speaks to this very clearly is Gabor Mate, and he, to me, is an example of someone who can be a counterpoint to Peterson on a variety of levels, and in fact speaks about Peterson. He has said, when I look at Jordan Peterson, when I read his work, I see suppressed rage.
Peterson, first he was very bright, extraordinarily articulate, and in some ways a compelling speaker. So he's an attractive figure in some ways. When I read him, I sense a lot of suppressed rage in him. In fact, I think his voice is choking with rage a lot of the time. It's interesting because he talks about rage, that you have to deal with it. I don't think he understands just how angry he is. In his book, he talks about how an angry 2-year-old child needs to be sit by themselves until they get over it. Rather than understanding why a child would be angry at age 2, what frustrations they're having, and what human contact they need to help them move through that anger, he says repress the anger. So he's all about repressed anger as far as I'm concerned. And it's very interesting how he talks about children. He talks about little varmints and little monsters and so on. I know that's meant to be humorous, but it's also a certain way of thinking of the young human child. So fundamentally, I see him as an agent of repression.
And in some ways, patriarchy is the platform where the agents for suppression operate. It's like that patriarchy encourages that, and people like Gabor Mate allow for the fact that there's a fundamental self-love that's waiting for you when you're able to be authentic and when you're able to stay in connection and when you're able to challenge some of the limitations of what patriarchy presumes for everybody, but particularly for men.
I'd say Peterson would align himself along notions of competency and assuming that those who are in power are the competent ones.
This is a trope that people just accept. Western society is a male-dominated patriarchy. It's like, no, it's not. That's not true. And even if it has a patriarchal structure to some degree, the fundamental basis of that structure is not power. It's competence. That's why our society works. It's only when a structure degenerates into tyranny that the fundamental relationships between people become dependent on power. It's not power. If you hire a plumber who's likely to be male, it's not because there's roving bands of tyrannical plumbers forcing you to make that choice.
But I think Helen Lewis, of the GQ interview she did with him, was pretty apt maybe to point out that some very incompetent people are in the higher rungs, as of a recent election, as of a couple of years ago. But I mean, the notion though that that can be pasted over as competence is like a really problematic notion that I think a recent book that I listened to by Daniel Markovits, The Meritocracy Trap, is a really concerning one, because nevertheless, I think we should still, in spite of Peterson saying we shouldn't analyze things on the basis of power, we need to actually consider who's disempowered, certainly, but that's sort of his rhetoric. You know, it's not power analysis. It's just competence, and it's acceptable. But so many people don't think so. And even in his own case, you know, regarding our own prime minister, there's this notion of resentment and that Peterson knows better regarding the prime minister's all of his decisions and over petty squabbles over Twitter. But I mean, the notion of merit is certainly something that we have to discuss and do it in a way that empowers everyone. Whereas I think Peterson, in the similar analogy to Trump, there's this notion of like just like very spiky, very spicy power kind of like moves that they make that allow them to take space and take up and interrupt their opponents and dominate the sphere, which I think is just incredibly damaging and not even inducive to knowledge, to understanding, and understanding especially one another.
I hate to do this, but between the three of you, you got 5 minutes.
Okay, keep it quick. I'll try. I love what you just said, Will, and I'm going to sort of just elaborate from my understanding on that, which is that this concept of competence and this concept of meritocracy all denies the question: who determines value? Who determines what has merit? Who determines what competency are we talking about? Competency at what? Because if the thing that we're defining competency at is exploitation and subjugation, then you can have very competent people in positions of power, and I think there's a reasonable case to be made that that's exactly what we have today. And that set of values of saying, what is merit? What competencies do we value and what competencies do we not value? So like if we were to value people who make their communities and those around them feel immensely safe and supported, that would be a very different value set than the value set of patriarchy today. And we would have a very different sense of men. We would look around this room not for bravado, not for proud shoulders, but for who around a given man looks the most relaxed. That is a different value set that we could look at the world through. And those definitions of value sets, we could go on for a long time there, but I really like what Will said, and I'll pass it on.
To the question, does patriarchy harm men? I would say, yeah, of course. I think any hierarchical system is going to do harm to probably everybody that lives within it, some more or less. In patriarchy, particularly kind of capitalist patriarchy, I see men being objectified as sources of utility. I think men grow up and they've attached their self-worth to GDP, which is why one of the most common groups of men to kill themselves is men who have retired. Because all of a sudden, the entire value that was socialized on them from the time they were 0 is gone. And it's terrifying. When I look at something like a patriarchy, it probably differ. I do think competency is something we value in our social hierarchies, but there's a twist there, which is we value competency and adherence to orthodoxy. So if you have two equally competent people, but one adheres to like kind of a white, colonial, Judeo-Christian individual, we're probably going to prefer that person, even if a lot of the things that are different are kind of arbitrary. They don't really matter to the skills and capacities of the individual. I think also when we look at like the patriarchy that we exist in, I think it's helpful to look at things that arise within hierarchical systems that have a functional utility, and things that arise out of a conventional and don't really matter. They're just axes that we kind of make up because our in-group is like, we all look the same, so this is probably like, straight hair is probably good. And it's like, no, straight hair is wholly morally neutral in literally every way. I've met lots of straight-haired people who are really competent and lots of straight-haired people that are not very competent at their job. And these conventions get extracted from probably in-groups, and then they arise in a culture that dominates, which we know that a white kind of Judeo-Christian culture dominates. And then we look for moral character by adherence to arbitrary things. And I think that that has a disproportionate effect on the groups we see affected, which is going to be people of color, anyone who's queer, and people who occupy the feminine. I had a really interesting conversation the other day where I was talking about masculinity as our culture sees it, which I think Brad is a great illusion. Kind of how we archetype masculinity in our society. It's the masculinities that we exist within. And I asked him, do you think competence is masculine or feminine or genderless? He's like, oh, it's masculine. And I was like, I'm pretty sure it's genderless. I don't know why. And I realized that we have this kind of cultural patriarchy that exists that assumes that if it matches what we value as masculine, we assume that it's also moral. And if it matches on what we view as feminine, it's nice. And I'm like, well, CEOs have to manage people. And if femininity is all about nurturing and social cohesion, which is kind of how it maps on in North America, that's our femininities. CEOs better be feminine because they gotta maximize strengths and weaknesses of people, right? But we just assume, well, once they're a CEO, now they're masculine again. They're organizing people, but in a masculine way. And you're like, why? And so that's kind of how I see the cultural patriarchy, is this objectification of kind of all bodies within it, and an extraction of kind of like subjectivity. And I'm so sorry I talked so long.
I'll try to be quick. Which is to say, so yes, absolutely, patriarchy is bad for men, and I think people have raised multiple good explanations for why. And I think as long as there has been what we can see with this feminist writing, that has been a thing which has been pointed out. But I do worry sometimes. I think it's important that we have these conversations, especially in relationship to Jordan Peterson and his audience. I do sometimes worry about this desire to center the problem of men, right? Even looking, thank you. Even in regards to sort of the examples you give, and I know why you picked them, right? But we look, okay, well, what are these things that are bad? And it's like, well, higher degree of workplace accidents. It's like, well, yes, because women aren't allowed in the workplace, right? Higher number of suicides. And it's like, well, higher number of successful suicides, lower rate of attempts at suicide, which is mostly a function of men having more competency and access to guns. There is this thing which is, as feminism and the status of women and other forms of sort of attacks on traditional hierarchy have gained ground in society, there has been this rearguard action to come in and go, but what about the men, right? You saw this in terms of like, what's the danger to boys? Like, what's happening to boys? Even as the status of men continues to be, speaking as one, A-okay, you know? And I don't want to dismiss the very real struggles that any number of men have in the ways in which questions of toxic masculinity affect them, all of them. But it is interesting the way in which it is amazing how much, even in attempts to not talk about men, we can come back around and center them. So that's, yes, thanks.
All right, so we don't have a lot of time left, so I want to now move on to the next section of this event, which is the audience Q&A. So if anybody would like to ask a question to our speakers, maybe we could have a line, well, I don't know how long for it.
Right here, starting with me.
Sure. So if you are interested in asking a question, maybe just raise your hand. Maybe we could have a couple of the organizers help just bring people together who have questions.
Do you want me to hop in between so that the online audience can hear the questions as well? Like, do you want me to just pick it up?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, somebody should have a mic with them.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah, you can just hold it pretty loosely.
So this is somewhat of a question, but I wanted to frame it in a certain way because in my experience as an Indigenous girl, growing up on reserve, okay, yeah, okay.
They won't.
Oh,
that mic doesn't do it. It's going to the stream. Yeah, you can just hold it.
Yeah. As Indigenous girl growing up on the reserve, amongst my own people, I got to experience the world quite differently of like, this is how we are, and this is how white people are. Because we've been segregated, and BC is, you know, when I was growing up, where I was living, it was mostly just Native people and white people in the school that I went to. And what I felt like among my people, among children, Indigenous children, was like, gender doesn't matter amongst us. We are all expected, like, we're all gonna play this team sport together. We'd always play sports co-ed. You know, the person who probably made me feel the most safe growing up was a boy, and he was my best friend. He was incredibly athletic and talented and coordinated. He would consistently, for years of playing lacrosse, he would score a goal hitting the very center at the back of the net, and it would come straight out. And we would all be like, yeah, the refs never gave him that goal. And he did that for years of his entire career. And he would often be the only boy playing with 4 girls, me and my 2 sisters and our cousin. And he was fun and playful and creative. Like, he was a really good actor, honestly. Like, I remember one time
I'm gonna have to cut you off because we don't have a lot of
Okay.
time left.
So
So
my
if we keep our questions
Yes.
just around 30 seconds or less.
Okay, so my question is, I just want to say, I celebrate men and boys because of people like him, and I just wonder, what are your experiences of, like, what makes you feel like you want to celebrate somebody? Like, who makes you feel safe? Who feels like light?
So I ran a series of recovery houses for people coming out of the prison system in the US for years. And in that work, I've also worked with what we call troubled youth, a whole bunch. And in that work, what I came to was that what makes me feel light or joy or resonance or celebration of someone is just proximity. Any single person that I get to know in enough depth, I end up falling wildly in love with and wanting to just wrap my arms around them. And as I do this work and I learn to love myself more through loving other masculine men more, it just cracks my heart open, and I feel so defensive and protective of men, because I see the way that we wound ourselves and we wound each other, and the world wounds us, and we just carry these patterns and pass them on. And I just want to grab men in my arms and hold them because of how much I love them, even when they've done unthinkable things. I worked with men coming out of the prison system who were active Nazis, who were harmful people, and watching them break down and cry and try and move forward in some way towards health and wellness just like brought their humanity to the certain work. You live with those guys for months, and all of a sudden you start seeing them more and more as a person. That doesn't mean they're not wildly harmful. That's not what that means, and it doesn't mean we don't need accountability. We do. We just need our accountability to be humanizing and actually breaking the cycles of violence and not just rebranding them in different ways.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
We'll
Yes.
probably only be able to have one for some reason.
Yeah, that's
So if you
just
want it to be a
fine.
specific person,
Ooh,
just-
it's a toss-up between you and you. Whichever one resonates. I think we've covered a lot of really neat subjects today. I feel like Jordan Peterson packs up information in like really easy to digest things for people who don't want to think too much. And like the point where it stops is, I think, war and subjugation and exploitation. It's like you can't think too much about this because eventually you might take responsibility for your own actions and like love yourself, and then it becomes harder to be shitty to other people. And so I like the subject of masculinity. There's two kind of like things that I think are elephants in the room here, which is war and the penis. But I want to sidestep all of those to talk about men in healthcare and microcosms of culture, because I work in a matriarchal environment. I'm usually in work environments with 10 women and me, and most of our men are unemployed with complex mental health addiction problems. And I find I am growing increasingly frustrated with some women's stigma of masculinity. And I find myself reactive in these female-dominated work environments to the workload I'm expected to take on and the crises that I'm expected to take on, because they are afraid of these men, and it feels unfair. And it's a weird kind of way to discriminate in a work environment where it's like, you get the violent cases, you get the ones where he's masturbating in the public space, you get the ones where you get all these really difficult men-themed crisis interventions, and it's like, oh, Jesus, and our population is 80% men. And so it feels like, and it's a bit of a Uno reversal. So anyways, probably to the counseling profession, any tips on working with female-dominated work environments with crisis in men?
I was waiting for the question. This was the question. So I understand.
It's like navigating women's fear of men in a professional environment, and then kind of being accountable for all masculinity as like a good male role model, which I'm not. And I'm not her definition of a good male role model. I love myself, but I'll tell you. 30 seconds, thank you.
Okay, well, I'll say this.
Working with women.
You're fun, and and you're funny. And so my suggestion is you sit down and talk with them in your fun and funny way and say, hey, this is how I'm experiencing this reverse discrimination in terms of gender and workload, and see where you get. I mean, the thing is, what you're addressing, there's a complexity involved, and some of it's been touched on in terms of feeling like women's interpretation of feeling safe, and so that's a real thing, and then so that can't be dismissed out of hand, but you could get a mediator, but I suggest you bring this character because it's great, and have a conversation that's real about the fact that it's impacting you in a negative way.
Maybe I'll. Yeah. Just to quickly bounce off of that, right? And I appreciate sort of the wanting to know what to do on an individual level. But it's worth saying the way in which these intersect with broader questions, right? Which is to say, I don't know specifically your job, but it sounds like it's in mental health care, which is heavily underfunded, right? And it's worth saying, right, the fact that it is a primarily female-dominated role is probably heavily underfunded because we heavily underfund women's roles, right? And so some of the stuff can't get solved at the individual level, right? It's structural, and that speaks to that, which doesn't help you, but sorry.
Okay, I'm going to hold everyone to that 30 seconds.
Yeah, it doesn't project.
So I'm not as fun or funny, but I have a question that sort of occurs to me, that if we can imagine ourselves in a future world where masculinity has a different complexion, different bad choice, a different appearance, different way of being in the world, and AI and mechanized manufacturing for the products that we need to live in a modern life, whatever that is now. Do you see us being able to dismantle patriarchy and toxic masculinity in a workforce where men are no longer valued for their superior strength or greater strength, physical strength, and the people who are creating the things that are manufactured or the food that's produced could be anyone, anywhere, so that we have a more egalitarian. I guess the question is, do you see mechanization and AI as part of the solution to dismantling?
30 seconds.
Who's that for? Who do you want me to?
Anyone who feels compelled to speak to it.
I mean, I think my short answer is no. And the reason my short answer is no is because mechanization has been around for a long time, and mechanization has already shifted the relationship of men and women in the workplace, right? In World War II, when the men went off to fight in the war, manufacturing production became heavily feminized, right? And that was just accepted and understood and worked perfectly fine. And when the men came back, all of those women were thrown out, right? There was no more question about who could do what. There had been this massive social experiment that had shown it. And yet, patriarchy was still able to step in and reassert those traditional gender roles, which is simply a way of saying, I appreciate the optimism, and I worry about trusting in a technological or material fix for what is a more deeply ingrained social problem, right? That I think there will always be a way, regardless of the technological structure, to maintain traditional hierarchies, and that we will develop technologies which maintain traditional hierarchies. And so I think we kind of have to deal with the one, and that will shape the other.
Thank you for all your very thoughtful insights to this very big topic. From my personal life, but just me personally, what I feel is one way to just a part of challenging toxic masculinity is just the idea that, yeah, you have a right to your opinion, but you have the moral responsibility to make sure that your opinion is based on facts, because your actions have consequences for the people around you, good or bad. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that, making sure your opinions are based on facts as part of breaking down toxic masculinity?
I guess I could attempt it, unless you have an answer.
Very quickly, I'll just say that I think that our efforts at rationality are always shaped by our lived experience and our emotional backgrounds and our unaddressed wounds. So our attempts to see facts it's a futile effort. I think that we're better off tracking impacts of our behaviors and tracking our own woundedness. And this relates back to the first speaker's question. This might be the last thing I say, so I'll just name this because they mentioned penises. And I just wanted to point out the taboos around this, around how you feel the whole room sort of like shrink in a little bit when that comes up. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of it is that we exist within a lineage of male genital mutilation. Statistically in Canada, 30% of the men experience genital mutilation as boys. So the first experience they have with this pivotal part of their body is non-consensual violence. In the US, it's 80%. And we think that doesn't have any impact on men moving forward. We think that doesn't shape our attempts to see what is factual about our bodies when we can't even look at these fundamental facts that shape our entire society. So like, what facts are we choosing to look at, and what facts linger in the periphery of our vision that we can't quite look at because it's too painful, we want to look away? Those are the wounds where our wisdom lies. Those are the wounds we need to tend and heal. So I move away from the rationality. I think I agree with your sentiment. I'm not trying to disagree with you. I think we should be grounded in reality. I just think that our efforts towards reality have to include the emotional, which we exclude as a way to try and avoid our woundedness.
Well, like what I'm saying is like pointing out when a person is making a logical fallacy. It's like reality isn't something that it can be anything I want to be, because then you're not responsible for the harm you might create to others.
That's absolutely true. And I used to teach rhetoric and logic in a different life. And what my experience was that never once in decades of pointing out people's logical fallacies has it ever corrected their underlying misconception. Because their underlying misconception is
Okay, we've got 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we're literally kicked out of here. So I want to make sure we get the last 4 speakers if we can for the last 4 questions.
If I can offer a fast anti-Ben Shapiro, nobody cares about your facts until they care about their feelings.
Yeah.
All right, so really quick.
Added to the line, I just don't want to stand.
You can, I don't know if we'll get to though, because we literally are going to be kicked out of here. So as fast as you can, whenever you're ready.
First of all, a general thank you. I'm going to keep it at that. And just to go into what we were just saying, what drew me to come tonight was partly what could we offer the younger generation of males as a alternative to Jordan Peterson. I have my own experience, and I'm not going to go into what I do, who I am, and all that, but I have my own experience with people, not just with young men. And I was wondering, besides critical thinking skills, whether or not the kids are going to go to school or not, like, what do you have in mind to bring tonight as an alternative to Jordan Peterson? Because I came here and I know no one that's on the panel. I didn't know about the healthy masculinity group either. I came here with an open mind, and I know that I have what it takes to guide my own light at the end of the day. And I trust that everyone's got me, and then not so great. So to me, Jordan Peterson reminds me of Freud. When I went to counseling school, I did a paper on him because I hated his guts, right? So that's what it reminds me. And I'm just, because we didn't really look at that tonight, and I'm wondering if anybody's got some feedback as to what is your dream? If you're going to create some freedom and some beauty and light and hope for the next generation, where should they look?
I'm not
Sure.
Well, I mean, it circles back to my own concern about defining a healthy masculinity. I think, like in regards to being able to pinpoint, as some folks do, that there's a gold standard, there's a particular fantastic role model that we can all aspire to. But then in an era where we have a lot of celebrities, a lot of people in the limelight that we really look up to, there is this notion that we might betray, which would be ourselves, I think, and I think that's almost more important, I think, in an existentialist way, and more concrete, like realizing it's like you can look to your own thoughts, and then also in addition to that of others, because we're all looking for like connection and community and togetherness and communication, and being able to resolve our problems. I mean, certainly, like, we need input, even if we are underrepresented here as a panel. Like, certainly I'll acknowledge that Sean Fay and Joan Roughgarden are fantastic trans writers and scholars that inform my own, like, they take up space in my own thought, and I think we should all let other people's thoughts, even our own children, our own parents, let their thoughts take up space, and their emotions take up space, like in a holistic way, of course.
So what I'm going to say is, because I think this is a good question to end on, but I don't want to let down the rest of the people who are waiting. Can we maybe do just one sentence answer from each of you? Because I think that's a good way to end it. And then the three that are still waiting, would you be okay with maybe staying behind a couple minutes later and just talking to some of these people? If you guys are okay.
Anybody else feel like to jump in if this can be after?
Yeah, absolutely. And anybody can.
We'll stick around.
Yeah.
Hang out.
Okay, so just one sentence answer from each of you.
I think there's a practical level that we need to apply that kind of alternative concept in terms of what is available. And I think men who already have contact with boys and coaches, for instance, and teams, and having it be more acceptable, and that you are only in those positions when you've done extra training around issues of vulnerability and emotional intelligence, and that this is part and parcel. So I think those points of intersection that already exist, that they need to be addressed in terms of re-educating. I think that's a practical way to address that.
Healing of masculinity for men has been intentionally quiet. Healthy men tend to be quieter to create more space, and that is beautiful and well-intentioned and potentially necessary. And guys, I need you to be louder. Yes. I need you to be louder about your woundedness and about your processes of healing. So you want to look for healthy masculinity, look behind you. Look at these men who have not spoken. Look at these two graybeards sitting here looking at you elders. I guarantee that you are beautiful, wise, wounded people. And I need you to be sharing that with your communities. The woundedness and the wisdom, they're the same thing. The grief and joy is all interwoven. So guys, show up. Be louder in your healing. Be louder in the fact that you've been wounded.
Yes.
I'm not sure if everyone's gonna like my answer. I spend a lot of times, like I said, with incels. And I've had probably 40 plus emails of incels saying, holy crap, thank you. I didn't realize, and I did this by, I think there's a desire to want to shame toxic masculinity for obvious reasons. The problem is that nobody cares about your facts until you care about your feelings. And there's this space of having to be willing to play ball with something that, like I said, I go on podcasts where it's, very bad in how they speak about women. And I try to focus on the light. I try to focus on mothers and fathers and things that these men can connect to. But maybe I just work in a really unique population. So I try to be real about what they want, which is some symbolism of Brad Pitt, but I try to remind them that Brad Pitt would actually be crying in a movie, and that's way more based and like a super alpha, and I try to use all that language to try to meet them where they're at, to kind of undo the social norm.
You asked about hope and light, and I think my hope is the fact that more children are being given more space to explore their own understanding and their own definitions of their genders and sense of self. And I think the more that happens, the more we will have the possibility of helping gender expressions to emerge. And previous questioner sort of pointed out that increasingly young kids are doing that, and they are exploring that, and they are finding what works for them. And so that gives me hope, and it gives me a sort of concrete thing that I can do and that I know others can do as well to make that happen. So.
And amen to free libraries.
If I could just, sorry, I thought my name would be, I mean, your boys are like, Jocko Willink, he's not perfect. But he's this red, massive man who's like, maps onto the Brad Pitt masculinity, and he writes books for kids, right? That's such a good start, right? I love Jocko Willink. He's not perfect, I love you, but Jocko Willink, but he's a really good start. Keanu Reeves spent so much of his life taking care, but he's like a Matrix guy, that's cool, fighting and stuff like that, which is what like a lot of young men want to map onto, whether that's bad or good. So trying to find these, like Matt Damon, it's a really good example of like a guy that's again directionally more willing to like have feelings and care about women and care about children and trying to kind of start people in the right direction of healthy role models.
Okay, I just want to say one last thing, or I guess we're going to have somebody else come up for just 1 minute, I promise. Is Kim McCullough still here? Kim?
What's the name again?
Kim McCullough?
I'm doing the job, Tim.
Oh, there she is.
So far away.
So again, it's just something to announce, just so we can sort of bridge the talk we had here today into, action going forward.
Thanks, Terry. Terry asked me to just introduce ourselves, just as a bridge to the community post this conversation, which has a lot of difficult pieces. And so I'm the clinic manager of MXN Men's Therapy Network. And we have a team of counselors, and we really try hard to have affordable, low-cost, or no-cost counseling. Sorry to rush down here. So I have some information here that you can take or scan if you want to. And just to let folks know, anybody who's self-identifying as male, we are here for you with specialized counseling and some low-cost counseling as well. So, is that good?
All right, I want to thank everyone for coming out today. The event was entirely a grassroots effort, so that means it was funded by people like you. If you'd like to help support the speakers and help support future events, please consider donating on your way out. Every amount makes a big difference. So let's give one last huge applause for our speakers. And thank you all.
Finally, please give a round of applause for Terry.
Yes.
Better than